Hello, everyone, and happy summer, and welcome to another author interview here on the channel. I am your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. Now, I'm very excited to showcase this guest on the channel because it will be their first appearance on the show, and hopefully not the last. Now, an active imagination has been one of my guest's defining attributes for as long as he can remember, with its creations often seeming more real to him than the world in which he lived. Upon discovering a talent and affinity for the written word, he began writing stories for fun at first, then eventually decided to make it more than a hobby. This has taught him to control his wandering mind while also providing an escape for him and others. Born in northern Illinois, his family moved to southern Missouri shortly after, where he currently lives with his two cats, Mary and Pippin, who provide comfort and drive him crazy multiple times a day. He rides a motorcycle, exercises regularly, and trains in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu when possible. My guest has written one series of 6 science fiction books, which explores what we believe and why we fight for it, but there are plans for many more in various genres, all of which will continue with his style of intense action and detailed characters. And the book we will be discussing today, viewers and listeners, is the one that caught my eye, which is, of course, Humble Glory, which is a Roman historical fantasy story, which I am so excited to share with you all. So, without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to first timer here on the channel, author Dodge Merrin. Dodge, thank you so much for coming on the channel today.
And thank you for having me, and thank you for reaching out when you saw the cover and for what you said about it that caught your eye. I appreciate that.
No problem, Dodge. So before we go into your journey as an author and creating not just Humble Glory, but the other books you've written, is there anything else you'd like to add about your personal background or your background as a writer?
Um, no, not at this time. I think the questions that you sent over for a preview will cover that. So when we get to it, I'll talk about those things then.
All right. Well, let's actually jump right in. So, based on from your bio, uh, imagination has been very, very integral to you growing up. It allowed you to write stories and create worlds for you and others to escape in. So, what was the first story that you wrote that was your aha moment when you realized, oh, I could do this more than just a hobby? I can make stories and potentially um, live off of this as a career.
Now, that's kind of a long answer and kind of vague. Um, sorry, I'm trying to check my notes here. Uh, so what it is, okay, I'll get back to that later. Uh, there was no real single moment. It was kind of a long journey. The
Okay.
first time I went to write a story or a book was in fifth grade, and that was kind of it seemed like a good idea at the time type of thing. Um, so over the next several years, I would it took me about 3 years to finish that one, and it was just the one draft. I'm sure as a writer yourself, you know that there are those that you start with and that just never see the light of day after that.
Yeah.
Uh, so then for a couple of years after that, I didn't really think about it again. Then I think it was junior year of high school. I had another idea and worked on that. I did a couple of drafts of that one, but again, that was the first one that I thought it's like, oh, I'll try and see about getting it published, but it never went very far. Then there was one after that. I did self-publish, but it turned out to be a bit of a mess, which I've realized,
Mm,
and I've since pulled it from publication. So it was the series after that where I really sat down and tried to work on it. And that was about 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, because it's been published for 10 years. Um, and yes, I do have a cat with me. So if you see me doing anything down here, that's probably what it is. Um,
No worries, no worries. I
So
can't say
yeah,
how
it's
many
just
other times I've had guests who have had cats, so you're good.
okay. So yeah, it's just basically something that grew over time, and I would say it's still growing. It's still something I'm settling with, and it was really only in the past few months. So basically, the beginning of 2024, where I really sat down, and it was maybe the end of last year. It's like I'm definitely going to try and make something out of this. Even back a few years ago, whenever I was thought I'd be wanting to do it, that's what I want to do with my life. It was still in the realm of a hobby, and I needed to put my focus on practical day job type of
Mm,
thing, making a living. So
right.
now I finally moved to where it's like, no, this is definitely what I want to do, and willing to make the sacrifices to try and make it happen.
Nice. Now, also in your bio, you've written quite a few science fiction fantasy stories, but Humble Glory is probably the one that is probably, I said, the one that really, really caught my eye. So, what can you tell us about Humble Glory and how you went about creating it and blending fantasy elements with historical aspects and realism?
Well, the main theme of the book is that any power or talent that we have is best utilized when it is tempered with humility, or perhaps you want to say wisdom would be another term for it.
Right.
So this book is about a young warrior. He's part of a warrior order that certain uh, members of family members in this town are selected to be trained from children up to adulthood as warriors. Now he's naturally talented. He's never lost a fight against someone around his. Obviously, when he's a child and an instructor came in much bigger than him, then yeah, he'd lose that. So he has the idea in his head that he can claim all this fame and glory that supposedly their code forbids. As far as now, originally, my biggest fantasy inspiration is Tolkien, Lord of the Rings. So
Mm-hmm.
originally, I was going to go with that aesthetic of medieval Europe. But then I saw a random video that said something like, okay, fantasy's always medieval Europe. It's so overdone. It's just done to death. Try to do something different. I was like, oh, okay. I like to be original. So I thought about it. I was like, well, I kind of have a minor obsession with the Romans as it is. I kind of missed my uh, moment whenever the whole Roman Empire meme was going on a while back. But it's like, okay, so that was just clear things. Like, I don't see a whole lot of fantasy out there that's based on Rome. So I'll go with that. And I studied. Now, it is just like Lord of the Rings. It's based on Rome, but it's not Rome. It's a whole unique creation.
Ah,
It's
okay,
its
I
own.
see.
It's its own world. But I studied like the used what I already know from my little bit of a obsession with it, but I also studied more about the architecture, the clothing, uh, the religious type stuff, and combat styles and fighting styles, such as with the army and everything, and incorporated that into creating this civilization.
Nice. And you know what? You bring up a really, really good point, which is you're right. The fantasy genre, when it comes to like the high epic fantasy, it always has a medieval Europe aesthetic. We don't really see a lot of the fantasy elements outside of that historical time frame because it's been done to death. It's been beaten with a dead horse. Now, that's not to discourage anyone who's writing fantasy in that style of medieval Europe. All power to you, but it's nice to explore historical fantasy beyond that. And honestly, I've only ever read one other book that actually delved in historical fantasy, but in Rome, and I actually have it right next to me. And that is, of course, by Chris Hackett, Invicta Fall of Rome, which imagines a Roman Empire where it does fall, or the western part falls in 495 AD, and this young man finds out he's a descendant of Jupiter. and he has to go to the Eastern Empire to rediscover his powers. All the while, the Catholic Church is hunting down worshippers of the old gods, and also the barbarians who rule Rome are trying to snuff out the last remnants of the Western Empire. So this is the only other book where I've seen historical fantasy in the Roman world, and this is an incredible book. And for Humble Glory, that already grabs my interest because I love seeing, the fantasy genre explored in different historical eras. So for you, Dodge, when you began crafting the story initially, what need or desire you wanted to satisfy for readers of historical fantasy?
My biggest thing is escapism. Um, so I want to provide a world full of excitement and adventure for people to explore.
Mm,
That while showing the things of this world in a different light, still takes them away from it and gives them a bit of a break from the hassles of life. And
nice.
does I know that's a kind of a quick explanation. Does that kind of answer your question, or you want a little bit more on
Yes,
that?
actually,
Okay.
it actually does, because it's nice for fantasy. It is an escapism because it escapes from the real world, even just for a little bit, and helps us dive into a new world that feels authentic and organic. Now, when crafting this from the initial stage to then, the edited version and the published version, what was your goal in setting out? Because, as you said, this has the aesthetics of the Roman Empire, but it's not necessarily set in Rome. It has the architecture, the characters may look Roman from what we have on recorded history. So how did you find the balance where, okay, it's going to look like Rome, it's going to feel like Rome, but it's going to be set in its own world?
So the balance comes into there was another video I watched a while back. It was one of those skits. I'm sure you're on YouTube, so I'm sure you've seen them, where one person plays multiple characters and then they dramatize the thing.
Yes.
So this one was talking about, I think specifically how history, the clothing is presented in like popular mainstream media, and of course most of the characters were just like all big on their thing, but the one sensible character, one of the others said something to the effect of, we're putting our own twist on it. And the sensible character made comments like, yes, but you have to know what you're twisting before you do that. So that's a big part of why I wanted to do the research on the actual Rome and Romans, and then go from there to put my own spin on it. So that way it's grounded in the real historical people and their culture, but it has my spin on it. One example I would give of that is I like to try and keep my writing as family friendly as possible. This one
Okay.
did. This one does have a bit more violence, graphic violence in it than my previous books. But other than that, when we think of the Romans, we tend to think of how sexualized they were, how big they were on all that. I don't like to put a whole lot of that in there. So I had to think about it. It's like, if I'm wanting to be realistic and present these guys as Romans, basically, how am I going to deal with that factor of it? That
Right.
is it there and just not mentioned in the story, or is their culture somehow different on that? And my solution there was, I don't know the Roman pantheon as well, but I know it's heavily influenced by the Greek pantheon, which I do know. Uh, I didn't do a whole lot of research on the mythology beyond what I already know about the Greek mythology.
Hmm.
But when creating their pagan religion, I went ahead and based off of that. And I thought I was also, whenever I was looking into it, I remembered something about the, and I have I'm kind of second guessing myself, but it is the Vestal virgins, right?
Yes, yes, you are correct.
Okay, so I started there and it's like, okay, there is um,
A
what is it?
cult?
Now, it's something exists in society that is that other things can be based on. It's a term used in law a lot. Think,
Oh, I think I know what you're talking about, but the word escapes me
yeah.
as well.
Uh, anyway, so the precedent. So I took that as being a precedent in Roman culture that there were groups and people who abstained from sex. And so I built on that. And whenever I created their pantheon, I created the king of their gods and the queen of their gods as actually having a strong marital relationship that the worshippers see as keeping them safe from evil. So that is why in their culture, uh, the marriage is very much respected, and even the sex is kept in that. Now, of course, it's realistic too that they are all over the place. I mean, you got different people with different viewpoints that sleep around with what they want, but I did use that as a basis for not being all over the place in the story and in the artwork that they see and everything.
Nice. That's actually very, very nice change of that because it is honestly true for those who like study Greek mythology and even Rome mythology. The Greek gods were not really the kindest and very honorable partners to their wives. The only one I would make the exception to is Hades in Greek mythology. The only thing he was guilty of was stealing his wife, but compared to his brothers, he is literally the nice one. But that'll be a discussion in a different video. But I do like that also you really sort of took an aspect of Roman culture that we know about and had it as like the basis for this new mythology in Humble Glory. So when transitioning from the final stage of like the draft part to then publishing it, um even before then, what was the initial reaction like from friends and family? Was positive, negative, even from like if you've had beta readers, what was their response like?
So these past few months, a few months ago, I started a mentorship program, and my first note here. I like to make my notes in notebooks and everything. So
Nice.
my first, so these are the notes, and it's in two notebooks now. But sometimes I'll just write something in my writing journal and then transfer it over because it's too vague to actually put down. My first note is for looking back at my writing journal is from December of 2019. So it's been while in the works, and a lot of that having to do with focusing on the practical side of life and not being able to work on this. But this
Right.
program, which is All Right Well writer to author program for anybody who might be interested, finally got it from that stage. It was still an outline. I hadn't even started a manuscript yet. So this past
Okay.
few months, finally got it to where it was published, and they have a feedback once a week. You can send in something for feedback. So that's where I've gotten most of my feedback, my beta reads, and the biggest response has been the world building. There, people are amazed at how detailed the world is and how expansive it is, even beyond the scope of the story. And they say that they are easily immersed in that world without hardly having to think about it. One person did say that he expected something to go a certain way, and I completely subverted his expectations. And that was nice to hear because that's definitely something I want to do. And something I was thinking about whenever I was thinking ahead to this interview, uh, I try to avoid using plot armor, relying on plot armor.
Ah, okay.
So if my main character is in a bad situation, I want the reader to be wondering, is he going to die? He or she going to die? And so to hear this feedback from this one person that I subverted his expectations, he expected something to happen and didn't, that was good to hear.
Nice. That's actually really, really awesome. And from those interactions with readers, would you say that it validated your goal when you set out in making Humble Glory?
Now that is something I can't quite answer yet. I don't think anybody has really read it all the way through.
Okay.
For example, in that program, we're just supposed to. It's set to one chapter only, about 3,000 words.
Okay.
So I haven't really had anybody read the whole thing through yet and get back to me. But so
Okay.
far, the indications are good.
Well, that's good. That's very, very good. Because I definitely feel like that's always like a great starting off point for any author when they get those feedbacks because it really gets the ball rolling. And now this leads actually to what I like to call one of the big reflection questions. There'll be a few in this interview, but as I'm sure you will agree, writing a book and being an author is not easy. It's hours and hours of editing, hours and hours of revisions, and even when you get the book finished, you got to find an editor, cover artist, and if you go the self-publishing route, you got to find, okay, which site am I going to self-publish through? Or if you go the traditional route, you got to make a query letter, a pitch. It's like, okay, what house am I going to submit to? And you have all of that, and that all leads to a lot of anxiety and stuff like that. And when you do present your work on the stage, be it digital or print, that voice of imposter syndrome is always there in the back of our mind, telling us that we've made a mistake, that we don't belong here. So for you, Dodge, for your journey as an author, have you ever had those moments of imposter syndrome? And if not, what has continued to discipline you to continue being a writer and author because you know that this is who you are meant to be?
Um, your last statement there, that I know this is who I'm meant to be, that I definitely feel 100% on. But I do live with imposter syndrome pretty much constantly. And that is one thing that has come up in this mentorship program, and they were assuring me that pretty much everybody feels that way. Uh, the recent example I have of that is I'm starting a series to try and reach out to my audience and to other writers and create engagement. Is create a series of videos uh, detailing my writing process. And I don't have any sort of degrees from schools or anything from where I work for the publishing house or anything like that. I've just been me working on this for years. It's basically experience from doing it. So
Right.
it is definitely a big part of imposter syndrome. It's like nobody's going to care what I have to say without some piece of paper backing it up, type of thing. But my mentors were telling me, it's like, no, put it out there. Uh, let's see. I think the way they said it's like, you are an expert on you.
Mm-hmm.
So I have started that series of one video. I haven't released it yet, but I do have it finished on my outlining process. And in the and of course, I'm fighting with myself the entire time, trying to come up with a good script and make it engaging and everything. Fighting with myself the entire time. It's like, no, it could be a little better this way, or maybe this person would prefer it this way. People are going to get so annoyed that I'm saying you have to outline or type of thing. And what about if you just want to dive into it? So it's one of those things. Just the short answer, I guess, would be that I'm just learning to live with it.
You know, that's honestly like so true because, you know, for us authors, we're always struggling with imposter syndrome and we go out of our way to like tell these great stories, seeing if people will like it. But ultimately, you know, you're right, as your people say, we are an expert on us. We know our stories better than anyone else. We know how it's going to go. We know the characters' feelings. We know because we literally brought them into creation. And now this actually kind of leads into the business side of being an author, which I'm really eager to hear your thoughts on, Dodge. So let's actually start with the first question. So besides Humble Glory, you have many other books that you have written. Now, when you wrote those books before Humble Glory, did you automatically want to go the self publishing route, or did you want to try your hand in with traditional publishing?
By the time I got to that those books, that series, I knew self-publishing was the best way to go. But before those, I did look into traditional publishing, and the things I found out about that is probably a bit of that imposter syndrome playing a part again. It's like these big publishing houses aren't going to care, and they get so many submissions. What's going to make mine stand out, type of thing. But then I also saw in there that a lot of traditionally published authors were switching to self-publishing,
Mm-hmm.
and one of their reasons for that is that the publishers and agents and all that, you're basically still doing all the same work you do as a self-publishing author, and the most you get is their name behind you. Uh,
Right.
so it's like, well, in that case, I might as well just do it myself, and it might take me longer, and I'll have to learn more stuff. But at least in the end, I will have I will have the control over my story. I won't have to change it to their marketing uh, scheme, and I'll keep more of the income.
Definitely. Yeah, that is actually very, very true. Traditional publishing has, it's still the dominant thing, but self publishing has changed a lot from like even just like 20 years ago. When we think of like self publishing, we think of less professional. It's not like, best quality. But now, 20 years later, you can't tell if one book is from a publishing house or not because the quality is like so hard to really like pick out the differences. And ultimately, as authors, it's whatever one suits us. Some of us want to go the traditional publishing house because we want to like hit that big market. Some of us want to go the self-publishing route because we want to have ownership and control of our stories. Whatever path we go on, it's all up to us. But, and this we talked on later, one thing that is apparent are the two paths that are within those two viewpoints, which is being an author and being known as an author, because those two paths are very different with their own set of goals and objectives and hurdles. So now moving forward from that, Dodge, and I'm sure you definitely agree, when we write our stories, we write for ourselves because we love stories like these. We know these characters better than anyone else. But when we present these to a new audience, we really have to figure out, okay, where does this book stand? Like, what genre does it belong in? Because we don't really consider that when we write. It's just like, okay, yes, this has fantasy elements, but does this qualify as something that belongs in the fantasy genre? Or, oh, this has historical elements, but is it historical fiction? We have to really take into consideration the audience, even though sometimes in the beginning we don't really do that. So for you, Dodge, um, this is going to be a two-parter. How important is it for authors to really take into account their audience? And for you, with your books, do you have a good understanding of your audience from the different books you've written?
So the first part of that question, how important it is to take as an author to take into account, it is very important because you don't want your book ending up with the wrong reader, and that
Mm-mm.
will end up because I'm not a numbers person by any means, so don't take this as to take it to the bank. But I
Okay.
would say at least over 90% of my reviews are positive, from both people I know and people I don't know, such as who read it online. Of those remaining ones that are negative, most of those basically saying something to the effect of, "This isn't what I like. This isn't what I read." In my mind, if that's the case, why are you leaving a review? But to that point of keeping your audience in mind, you don't want a sci-fi book in front of a fantasy person, for example. I
Right.
mean, they're often put into the same category. Uh, but if I go to read a book about space travel and fighting aliens and everything, and I pick up something that says it's a sci-fi book, and it turns out there's wizards and sword play and everything, it's like, uh, okay. But then at the same time, as I was saying that, Chronicles of Doom popped into my head, and that's
Mm-hmm.
basically sci-fi fantasy where they're fighting
Yeah,
with
that's
swords and
true.
magic type stuff, but they have the ships and everything too. So you do have to take that into account. Make sure you're getting your book in front of the right readers. Um, Now, as for me, I can connect with people one on one pretty well, but
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to connecting with groups, I'm terrible. So I would say I'm still at a point where I don't understand my wider audience very well and how to engage them with them as a group. Like
Right.
right now, you and I are engaging one on one pretty well, and I've engaged with my readers in this same way before. But whenever I go out there trying to promote myself and everything and try to connect with people as a group, I get lost and fumble a lot.
Okay. Okay. Nice. And now another business question, which I'm eager to hear your thoughts on, but I think you may have touched on a little bit, is as authors, we're always inspired by the books we read growing up. Like if we want to write in like sci-fi genres, we typically would read sci-fi books to help us understand, okay, what is it that people like about science fiction? What type of characters do they like? The scenery, the language, whatever. That's same in all genres. And even before that, we just read the type of books that we like growing up, be it sci-fi, fantasy, historical, thriller, noir, whatever. So for you, Dodge, what authors and books would you say have really helped you craft your author voice in terms of world building, characters, prose, and everything else in your books?
Well, I have to make a somewhat uncomfortable admission, which is that I don't read as much as I would like to anymore. Basically, the time I would have to read is the time I'm spending writing. Uh, that being
Okay.
that being said, uh, I have been inspired because whenever I try to relax or I want to relax, I good watching TV type of thing. So I get inspired by some of that stuff. So
Okay.
I'll come back to books and authors that have inspired me in a moment. But my biggest inspiration, I don't know if you've heard of it, not everybody has, but the TV series Babylon 5.
I've heard of it, but I've never watched it.
It's my favorite series, and I learned J. Michael Straczynski is the creator, and he was heavily involved with it throughout the whole process. He wrote many of the episodes himself, for example. Uh, he outlined all 5 seasons of the series and built the world before filming a single episode. And that inspired me to do the same thing with my, because like the book I previously had published, but I decided it was a mess I had to pull. I realized it's because I didn't do uh, very good planning at all. So then I planned the series, and that has so outlining and taking notes has considerably improved my writing and keeping everything flow and connected. And in that same category, Tolkien. So I've seen the movies; they're my favorite movies. But I have also read the books,
Mm-hmm.
and I managed to get through the Silmarillion. I don't. There's a lot to remember in that, but
Yes.
in that character that has greatly influenced, especially now that I did do this sci-fi, not sci-fi, fantasy novel, greatly influenced my world building to really dig into the world building even beyond the out plotting the outline, uh, and the history, like all the history put into that. Now, that being said, I'm far away from reaching his level. For one thing, he worked on the same thing pretty much his entire life.
Mm-hmm.
And beyond that, Chronicles of Dune, I mentioned that. The political intrigue and everything, and just how expansive that is. Kind of an aha moment for me with all this was reading a couple of the Star Wars Expanded Universe books.
Yes.
And it really struck me just how big of a world, galaxy, he created, and how these other authors can just jump right in there and write stories, more stories in that world. So that also inspired me to. So that, I mean, they're based on the movies, but they were books. Uh, Inspired me to create these vast worlds with stuff that's going on even far beyond what's going on in that story.
Nice, nice. I'm actually glad you brought up the Star Wars expanded universe because just a little tangent, viewers and listeners. I'm a big Star Wars fan, and I've read a lot of the expanded universe, and you're absolutely right. From what other authors have been able to do within the world set out by George Lucas in the beginning, it's just incredible. And I didn't read a lot of Star Wars books growing up. Only was like in like middle school, high school, and I still read them now. And I'm just very, very intrigued by the world building these other authors have created and bring in new readers and new audience, which actually goes into the next question, which kind of ties back to the first, which is audience, which comes to readership. Now, I bring this question up, viewers and listeners, because, as you said before, audience is important when writing a story. However, within your audience, your readers are definitely going to change. What I mean by that is you can have people who have read every type of fantasy from dark fantasy, epic fantasy, high fantasy, urban fantasy, whatever. And then you'll have those who have never read a fantasy book a day in their life. I'll give an example. 2 months ago, I interviewed two authors, Desiree Proctor and Erica Harrell, who wrote the book Nuclear Power, which was a comic slash graphic novel that was alternative history and a little bit of a thriller, where it imagined the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 going haywire. Nuclear fallout with the U.S. being reduced to the original 13 states, transforming into the American Union. When they wrote that book, they were trying to get people who are interested, in Marvel, who are fans of the X-Men, Patriot as well because of the history aspect. What they didn't anticipate were people who grew up during that period who realized, oh, this actually could have very well happened. Maybe out the nuclear fallout where you got superpowers, but definitely the political and geopolitical aspect that would have shaped the entire United States and the rest of the world was fascinating. And going back to you, Dodge, has your readership changed from what you initially expected when you began your journey as an author?
Uh, I would say that again falls into the category of my difficulty connecting with groups. From what I've seen, uh, I would have the best I can answer. The best answer I can give to that is that recently I was reminded that there are a lot of older generation people who like science fiction. This is my first fantasy novel. Just to clarify, I don't think I've clarified it yet. Humble Glory is my first fantasy novel. The previous four-book series was science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I've done a lot of my marketing and everything. I was recently, for some reason, I had it stuck in my head that science fiction was a relatively new genre and it was for younger audiences. But I was recently reminded, it's like, no, science fiction has been around for a long time,
Yes.
even before movies, and something like Star Wars and Star Trek made it popular. And so there are older uh, people in the older generations who enjoy science fiction as well. And in this context, I was reminded not to forget about them whenever I'm doing my marketing, whenever I'm seeking out my audience.
Awesome. And also to add on to that, as an example of how science fictions existed longer before like even Star Wars and movies, I forgot his name, but the author of John Carter of Mars. You want to talk about a science fiction story that literally is the granddaddy of all science fiction, and you can even argue a little bit of fantasy too, is that book. I read the first 5 books. I was blown away because keep in mind, viewers and listeners, Edgar Rice Burroughs, that's his name. He was writing stuff about planes, vehicles, energy weapons during the early 1900s. Who would even conceive of that at that time? We generally think of, as you said, Dodge, that science fiction was fairly new, maybe 40 years, of course, with Star Wars. But Star Wars itself was even like a child of the John Carter of Mars because that literally brought science fiction to the forefront and it was just evolved over time. And now we actually go into probably one of the biggest questions, Dodge. So brace yourself. And that is, I definitely feel, which you may have some comments on, probably for new authors, first time authors, whenever they write a story and they get the initial feedback, they believe, oh, yes, this is going to start my legacy. I'm going to be like New York Times bestseller, whatever. And then there's even sometimes authors have had to change their stories or add things that they wouldn't add because, oh, you need to add this because this is what's popular right now. This is what's selling, or even completely changing the genre. Case in point, romance fantasy is the most read subgenre of fantasy in the book world. It's read 6 times a month more than the other books. And authors will try to scramble to um, get that gravy train. And ultimately, their work is going to suffer because it's not their best work. And this goes back again to the two paths for authors: to be an author and be known as an author. And to be an author, from my understanding, is you're writing to write. You don't care about um, what is it, money or anything. Yes, it's good to get some revenue, but that's not the sole purpose. To be known as an author means you're going out of your way to really get your name out there. You're trying to get boosts. You're trying to market yourselves. You're trying to be everywhere all at once to get your name across. Sometimes you'll succeed, sometimes you won't. And this leads into a very powerful quote that well, not a quote, but a statement I got from a fellow author who I interviewed a year ago, Natalie Wright, who said the biggest lie a first time author can believe is that the debut novel is going to be the start of their legacy. Now, of course, there are exceptions to that rule. There are authors who are able to achieve award winning status based on their first book alone. Congratulations. That is a huge accomplishment. And be able to live that success is equally powerful. But on the other side of the coin, you have authors who rise, fall, rise again, and fall down hard. And ultimately, that imposter syndrome comes back with a vengeance because you did not meet your goals and you did not meet your readers. So, for you, Dodge, in your own opinion, how important is it for first time authors to really understand that their debut novel does not guarantee it will be the start of their legacy, but it should not deter them from writing if being an author is something they truly want to do and be?
Uh, I've heard it said before in different ways, but if you're wanting to get rich, then don't try and be an author. Uh, so if that is your goal, you might as well give up. If making money is your goal, and you think this is a quick and easy way to do it, then you're you've already lost. But if your goal is to be an author, and there is, I am very much in the crowd of the story is what matters. If you don't want to buy it, uh, that's on you because, uh, and I'm not voicing any particular political affiliation in this statement. But if you write a story and you're trying to market it by making it about whatever you see as a popular political viewpoint, um, I've lost my train of thought there. I'm sorry.
No, no, no problem.
But okay, I'll reverse. I'll walk that back a little bit. The story, it's about the story. It's not about politics. It's not about what's going on in the world. It is about what's going on in the world, but it's not about preaching your viewpoint to people. It's about the art. That being said, art in all its forms has always been about showing what's going on in the world and relaying what the artist is, how the artist views the world. But that has to be done as part of the story. The story comes first, and everything else is integrated into that. If you're starting with uh, telling people your thoughts and your feelings and everything, and then making the story is going to suffer, and people probably won't want to get it. And I think I've gone away from your question a little bit here, but it is important. to try and walk it back to your question, I was told during this mentorship program that about 10 books, you need to get 10 books out there before you really start gaining momentum.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, your first book, like you said, there will be a rare occasion where the first book does uh, matter, does take off. Uh, but for the most part, right now, probably especially in the self-publishing world, you need at least 10 books out there. So keep that in mind if you want to be an author, and it's perfectly fine if you want to make money doing it, even if you have a dream of being rich and famous. There is a spectrum there running from the each end, from the people who just doing it for a quick buck to the people who are doing it just because it's what they enjoy. There is a spectrum in there of
Yes.
how much you care about the money and how much you care about the story, and how much you're willing to sacrifice one or the other to get to your goal. Uh,
Definitely, definitely, and you're absolutely right. And tying it back to what you said in the beginning, I definitely think both in fantasy they do have a lot of. I've read a lot of books that have some instances of imitating real life, and it's also like that balance. You want it to be an escapism from reality, but you also want to show that there are some similarities, but you have to be very delicate. And that also ties into, okay, if you're an author, let's say you're writing for a young adult audience, how heavy-handed do you want to go with the plot and the overall message that you're trying to convey? You have to reel it back. So that comes from time and trial and error and everything. And that, of course, comes to a very powerful statement, which another author said, which is grit trumps talent. Doesn't matter if you're the best prose, doesn't matter if you can create the best characters, doesn't matter about any of that. If you're not willing to go through the fires and the flames, the hurdles that every other author has to go through, and think that, as you said, it's a get rich quick venture, yeah, you're going to lose your passion for writing very easily. I've actually had an author on the show a month ago who said that he had to step away from that because he nearly lost his passion for writing because he was trying to make a living off of it as his sole source of income and career. So there's a whole bunch of things that have to go into it. Ultimately, focus on the story, focus on yourself as an author, and just growth. See what kind of genres you like to write, find out what kind of stories you like to tell. And then from there, grit transforms into talent because it may be your 10th or even 20th book that really gets your name out there to the masses. And when that happens, you can be like, hey, you liked my 20th book, you should see 1 through 19 to see my journey as an author, because I guarantee you're going to get different audiences for the different books you've written. Plus, it also helps to have a good following and fan base from fellow authors, friends, and family to really be in your corner. And especially now more than ever, social media has been a huge helper for self published authors. I cannot tell you, viewers and listeners, how many authors I've met on Instagram alone, and who majority the guests I featured from uh, earlier this month or even earlier this year to now have all been from Instagram. It's incredible. And just the support and feedback from the indie community is amazing because we're all in the same boat. We all want to help one another. We're not in competitions with one another because we want to be there for each other's successes. For you, Dodge, who would you say have been in your corner since day one, and also more recently?
that's actually a hard subject for me to talk about because I feel, for the most part, very much alone in my journey. Um, I will uh, put my dad on a bit of a pedestal. He's been very supportive. Uh, he's not very much of a reader, but he is a thinker. So, like with the TV stuff and stuff he watches, he
Mm-hmm.
gets thoughts and everything, and he'll share those with me. And of course, he does read my work and gives me his thoughts on that, and that's helped me out. And then it was also um, his supports that made it possible for me to do this mentorship program. And then, of course, the mentors in that program. Uh, were a big support and helped me get past this imposter syndrome type of thing, and giving me that feedback. It's like, no, your writing is good. You have talents. Don't worry too much that a whole lot of people haven't seen it yet or aren't giving you all that you're not huge yet, basically. And
Right.
on that note, I want to say real quick back to what we were saying on the last question. Um, there is a difference between making a living as an author and
Mm-hmm.
getting rich as an author.
Yes.
And then back to the viewpoints, each author, an artist of all stripes, putting their views into their work. I like to boil it down to I don't want to tell people what to think. I just want to get people to think.
Mm. That actually goes back to something I like to call the three E's: educate, entertain, and enlighten, because you can do all three in all stories. Like for educate, you can educate people on like a topic or something that may be in the real world, but you want to get like little sprinklings here and there in your story, depending on what it is. Entertain is probably the biggest one because as authors, we want to entertain our readers. We want them to take them on a journey that makes them immersive, that's immersive for them and they enjoy it from beginning to end. And enlighten, we want them to reflect afterwards. Why do so many people use, case in point, Lord of the Rings is a good template for like reflection of like education and enlighten? Why? Because there's so many overlapping themes in Lord of the Rings and many other works as well. Like, okay, I'll give an example. Dune. You could follow easily the three E's of Dune, where the author literally had to make a third book to get his point across about Paul Atreides and what ultimately he represented. And I don't want to spoil it because if you haven't read the books or even seen the movies, I don't want to spoil it for you. But there is a big message in the Dune series, especially the first three books. And those three E's fall heavily into it, and ultimately it's much better than my original model, which was writers are cheaters and thieves, where we cheat people at a time, we make stuff up, and we steal from one another because the same story has been told numerous times. It's a big evolution. And before we go into the final question, Dodge, are there any authors you would like to give shout outs who you've met on social media, who you've interacted?
Um, I haven't read her work because she's a romance author, but Maria Secoy is the founder of All Right Well and the Writer to Author program. So if you, and it was, so I did read a little bit of her book, The Truly Successful Author, and that's where she's talking about her system for getting out there and getting sales and everything. And it was one of those things where I don't read nonfiction very well.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't remember what I've read for some reason, but that one really brought me into it, and I was able to understand it. Um, Beyond that, I know I was part of a writers group for a while, but uh, I think I'm just trying to think of how to say it where it doesn't sound bad because I don't mean anything bad by any means. But I
Right.
think basically real life and the practicalities of life and everything overwhelmed them, so they haven't really been writing for quite a while. So I don't want to throw their names out there and people find that they're not that they haven't done anything for.
Okay. Okay. I respect that. All right. So now we get to the final question of this interview, Dodge. So, with everything that you learn and still learning of the author's journey, what is your word of wisdom to fellow authors out there who want to get their name out there or take the first step into the world of being an author in this industry?
Well, you just kind of activated my imposter syndrome again, so forgive me if I'm a little bit hesitant in what I'm saying.
No problem.
Um, my biggest thing that I've learned is do your research, see how others do it. Like you said, we steal from each other, but in this case, steal, if you're doing it right, is kind of more like steal. You need to learn from how to best and even uh, how others have done it to know how to do it yourself.
Right.
But don't get caught up in having to do it that way. Don't force yourself to do it exactly the way anybody else has done it. Look at what they've done, do your research, do your due diligence, but then make it your own and tell your story your way. Take what makes sense to you, what you are sure you can keep up with, what builds momentum. You're not really forcing yourself to do it. After a while, you don't even notice you're doing it anymore because it just comes naturally to you. But start with seeing what others are doing and how they're doing it, make it your own, and then tell your story your way.
Awesome. Awesome. And with that, viewers and listeners, we have come to the end of this amazing author interview here on the channel. I want to give a huge thank you to Dodge Merrin for coming on the show. And before we officially sign off, Dodge, where can people find and engage you on social media to talk with you as well as purchase your books?
To purchase my books, the easiest place would be Amazon authors page. So you should be able to find Dodge Merrin. So in case so this is the first book in my sci-fi series, and this is Humble Glory, the one we were talking about today. So if you see those books, then you're in the right place. Um, my biggest place, my focus on social media right now is YouTube. I just enjoy making videos. I think I said it before that I'm just a very visual person, and
Mm-hmm.
that's fun for me. And I'm starting. I will be putting. Sorry, I'm losing my voice a little bit. I'm working on a series of audio stories, which I'll be posting on YouTube. After that is Instagram. So, like you said, that's where you found me, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be posting more on there. So that's kind of a way I'm getting around my imposter syndrome. I'll just post a picture with the hashtags and not have to worry about coming up with something fancy for the text. I do have a Facebook page. I'm not as active on there anymore, but and then I am also launching a newsletter after the holiday where I'll have updates and extra content and more right there. And then, of course, the newsletter you can respond to and reply to, and then I'll see that, and then uh, maybe start some conversations through that.
Awesome. I will link all those down below in the description of this video. Thank you all so very much for joining us for our second author interview for the month of July. Again, a huge thank you to Dodge Merrin for coming on the show. And hopefully this will not be the last time. And hopefully he'll be back again and tell us more about his other works, his science fiction stories, which I'll be eager to learn more about. So, Dodge, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
And thank you for having me. And there is a sequel to Humble Glory, which I'll be starting work on soon. So maybe that will even be an excuse for for another interview. And again, thank you for having me.
Awesome. And as always, viewers and listeners, make sure to like and subscribe and comment down below what was your favorite part of the interview. And as always, this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out, wishing you all a wonderful day.